Good morning again, Coffee Chat friend. Steve here with a few comments on this topic called Law of Attraction. This is something that was popularized a long time ago, but made its way more into the public discourse about maybe 6 years ago or something like that, maybe 7 years ago, with both, I would say, the teachings of Abraham Hicks, but I think even before that, the book by Rhonda Byrne called The Secret. And there's been much talked about it and so on. And is it valid? Is there something to it? I know I was quite intrigued by it. It made a lot of sense to a great extent to me. Yes, there's probably parts missing that people are not seeing and whatnot, but it has its basis in physics for sure. The Newton's laws of motion: for every force of action is an equal and opposite reaction. This idea that what goes out comes back. There's ancient scriptural references to it, ancient writings about it. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about my take on it in a practical sense. I'm going to mention two areas where this makes sense. The one is the reaction on self. The other one is the reaction from others. So, in other words, when we behave in a certain way, just our behavior has an effect on us, which then manifests within ourselves. And the second one being that when we react around other people react to us in a certain way. So, along that line, and very basically on self, what I would say is when we behave in a certain way within ourselves, then we get, I'm not saying it's 100% direct, but there's an effect that takes place within us, which then determines to some extent our quality of life experience. An example would be if I choose to eat in a certain way. Well, then over time, I get to experience the results of that. If I decide to work on myself, on my way of thinking, then just even within myself, I get to experience a different way of living. If I decide to undertake an exercise routine on myself, then in time I get to experience the results of that exercise routine, whether that be greater cardiovascular strength, muscular strength, and even maybe greater mental clarity because of better blood circulation or whatever. So that's like a law of attraction, isn't it? I have initiated efforts within myself, and as a result, it's like an equation. It's kind of like a law of attraction is like an equation. It almost has to be an effect. It's a cause and effect, right? Now, reaction from others. I would say that, so this is the theory that when we are kind to people, for example, or we are giving, or we are tithing, or we are smiling at people, this sort of thing, that this comes back to us. And the argument that people put out to sort of counter this is that is not always the case. So if it's not always the case, then it's not a law, right? Because a law is something that's laid down, something that doesn't change. A law would be something like you step off the roof of a house, you're going to fall to the ground. That's a law because it doesn't matter who does it. It doesn't matter when it's done. It doesn't matter whether it's a certain time of the year or anything like that. It doesn't care. It just happens. That's the law. So if in fact we are kind to somebody and we are giving, or we are angry at somebody, or whatever it is that we are to somebody, and we don't get an attraction back, we don't get a reflection back, nothing seems to change, then actually it's not a law. So let's not call it a law then, maybe in this case. Let's call it sometimes sort of a trend, maybe, something like that. Because it does work sometimes, we know that. Now here's my thought on why it works sometimes and why it doesn't work sometimes. Use the example of if you know somebody really well and you kind of know their reaction, and that guy's name is Bob, and you say, you're in the same room as Bob and you're going to ask Bob a question, you say, hey Bob. Well, Bob, if he hears you, is probably going to answer, what? So in that effect, if you were to do it 100 times at once, Bob would probably become annoyed. But if you do it in the regular living of every day, and every time you do it, there's something legitimate about it. If you say, hey Bob, Bob will say, what? So if you were to measure that in terms of a scientific study, you could say that is a law of attraction that is taking place. Whenever you say, hey Bob, Bob will say, what? So there's a predictability. You can actually measure it, just like in a lab experiment. You go in and you do something and you get this result, and you replicate it, and it actually works. Now, if you were to take a rock and call that rock Bob, and you were to put that rock in your living room, and you were to say, hey Bob, to it, well, it wouldn't respond to you, right? So there is no universal law of hey Bob. One Bob replies, the other Bob doesn't. So that's not a law, right? So there is no universal law of attraction called hey Bob and getting what in response. So this comes down to there being different. And so if there was 4 Bobs who were human being Bobs, and you were to do the same thing, you would get a different response. Some Bobs may not respond at all. Some Bobs may not know your language. Some Bobs may not hear you because they're deaf. Some Bobs may not answer because they're annoyed. All kinds of different reasons. But in terms of the human being, in comparison to the one who responds all the time and the one who doesn't respond, I think there is a spectrum which can be related to human beings also. And the spectrum is not as extreme as the rock, but the spectrum, I would say, goes all the way from empathy to psychopathy. And the degree to which there is empathy is the greater degree to which there will be a response towards what we put out. The greater degree of psychopathy is, or at least the favorable response, and the degree to which there is psychopathy, which is basically a mental illness, is the greater degree that we will not get the response, predictable response that we want. Because there's a lot being said about how, when we smile at people, smile and the world smiles with you. Well, what if people don't want to smile, or they want to frown because you smiled? So I would say that the degree to which this works is the degree to which there's empathy on the part of the other. Empathy is the ability to feel your feelings, or to be literally, it means in the sorrow with, but that gets translated into modern day English to be being able to feel, or being able to be with, being able to feel basically our feelings. So somebody who has empathy rather, if we are happy, they're going to feel that happiness. If we are sad, they're going to feel that sadness. They're going to be able to sense us, just like they're able to see us. So therefore, the greater degree, the greater possibility of reaction to how it is that we are living our lives. Whereas somebody who is psychopathic, the origin of that word means like a mental anguish along that lines. Let me see here. Literally, it's like the pathy normally means like the sorrow side of things, right? Or the grief. And it's it's like a mental sorrow, or a mental feeling is what it means, but it typically means on the downside of the feelings, like the grief and so on. So like an illness. So what it means is it doesn't feel. So it's like nature, or that rock. That rock is psychopathic. It doesn't have that mental capacity to feel anything, so therefore it doesn't even reply. Even if it could hear, it doesn't mean anything to it. It's just in and of itself. That's it. So therefore and I think every one of us has elements of empathy, elements of psychopathy. It's just a matter of, how much and when. And therefore that would explain, I think, why this law of attraction between each other, between us and other people, is not universal. There's probably many other reasons too, but it's not a law, I would say, when it comes to us human beings interacting with each other. It's not a law, because a law is laid down and it's consistent. But this is not consistent, because in some cases we're talking to human walls, you might say, who don't, for whatever reason, it could be some sort of mental distraction, all kinds of things, they're not, we're not hearing it. Or they're not hearing it for some reason. They're just, it's irrelevant to them. So therefore they're not reflecting back. It's like the rock is not reflecting back to us, right? So to sum it up, I would say yes, that there is something to this law of attraction, but it's not really a law. It is, we can affect it within ourselves, so we can actually change ourselves, and it has an effect on us. That's more along the lines of a law. If you eat a better diet, we're going to feel an effect. That's more along the lines of, that's more consistent, right? And then so that's the first one. And the second one is how it affects, reactions we get from others. They're not consistent because that's not law-like. They're more consistent when we're dealing with empathetic people, and less consistent when we're dealing with people who have a psychopathic tendency. There's one thing I missed, which I should have mentioned. And it's not great to have a conclusion, but it is anyway. In terms of effect on self, even when we are putting out kindness and this sort of thing to others who do not react, we're actually, even though we're putting it out to others, we're actually putting it into ourselves. We're creating a habit of beneficial behavior, shall we say. So that even though we're putting things out to others, if we're showing acts of kindness and we're not getting a response, it can still have an effect within ourselves as behaving in a certain way, as putting out a mental force, you might say, which might be changed from what it was. So that has an effect too. Just a few thoughts. See what you think anyway. Law of attraction. Is it really something? I would say that it is, but it's except that I would call it attraction, or cause and effect, really. However, I wouldn't call it a law in the strict literal sense, because law is typically something that's laid down and always works. So if we're going to think that we can consistently put something out and get certain reactions back from other people or from entities that we don't have direct control over, then no, it's not like a law. But within ourselves, kind of like it kind of is, because we have a greater degree of control over ourselves. Hope this was interesting. Please feel free to suggest comments, suggest topics that we can talk about, whatever, and I'll talk to you soon again. Bye-bye for now. Steve is my name.